I am a worship leader and I'm having difficulties really worshiping the way I want. This is because I'm thinking about leading the song well and helping people connect, but I don't really go deep the way I do if I'm alone, not leading. It's kind of hard leading and really worshiping deep for me. I'm concerned about leading the song correct, etc. How can I really effectively lead and worship deep? That's an email that I got from a worship leader a couple weeks ago, and I think it touches on something that so many worship leaders feel is like, okay, I am in charge of this gathering, and it seems like I have so many responsibilities on Sunday that I find it hard for myself to worship as I'm leading my church. Because I'm thinking about playing the right chords, singing the right words, hitting the right notes. I'm worried about technology. Are you ever worried? Maybe this is just me. But are you ever do you ever sit there and you're just worried that something with the technology is going to go wrong and you hear like a slight little pop in the sound system and you're like, oh, I'm on guard now. I've got to keep listening for that. I do that all the time, and it's kind of frustrating because most of the time technology just works fine in my church. I'm not saying it always does, and sometimes it goes wrong. But most of the time, it's probably fine. Do you ever have those thoughts in your head and you're like, when I'm actually singing and leading the songs, I can't worship? Maybe even whenever your pastor is preaching, you can't worship through the preaching of the word because you're worried about the technology side of things. Well, I want to share with you something that changed how I think about worship and leading worship, that now I feel like, you know what, every Sunday, and maybe all the Sundays where I thought I wasn't worshiping, now I feel like I'm always worshiping. And I think that comes from 3 misunderstandings that I had about worship, and maybe you have them too. And the first misunderstanding is this. The first misunderstanding is what worship is. Worship is a treasuring of God above all other things in our hearts that overflows into external acts of glorification. So it is something that happens inside of us, so it should be a feeling in that sense. It should be like, man, I have received revelation from God through his word, and that caused me to treasure him in my heart. And now I feel the affections for God because of who he is and everything that he's done for me. So it is a feeling in that sense, but then that feeling overflows into external acts of glorification. So hopefully when people are singing in your church, it is not just singing for singing's sake, like we talked about in last week's video, but it is an overflow of their treasuring of God in their hearts. Now, here's the distinction. Singing is one way that treasuring of God in our hearts overflows into external acts of glorification. It is one of those external acts of glorification, but it is not all of the acts of glorification of God. And so we need to expand our mind as to what worship actually is. And it's not just a feeling, although it starts there, and we're going to talk more about feelings in the last point of this video. I'm just talking about the affections of God. Do you have an affection for God when you're leading your church? First of all, ask yourself that. Because if you don't have an affection for God, if the things that you do on Sunday don't start with an affection for God, namely being, I think God is worthy of my worship, whatever form that's going to take, do I think God is worthy of my worship? Do I treasure God in my heart? And now it might come out a different way than the rest of our church on Sunday, but I would say that the act of planning your services, of sacrificing your time, of coming to worship rehearsals, of showing up on Sunday early, of leading your church in worship and having those extra responsibilities, if that flows from a treasuring of God in your hearts, which I don't know why you would do it if it didn't. I guess you could do it because pridefully you want people to look at you, but I don't think that that's what most worship leaders do, who ask this question at least. Why would you do all those things if you didn't think that God was worthy of his people joining collectively together to worship him? Do you see how what you do on Sunday, maybe we can already see that what you do is worship. Let me give you some biblical examples of this, though. First of all is just the definition of worship in the New Testament. There are 2 main words for worship in the New Testament. I know there's a bunch in the Old Testament too, but let's talk about the New Testament. The first is the word proskuneo, and that means to bow down, or it literally means to blow a kiss towards, but it's like to bow down in reverence. It's like this picture of when the king walks in the room and you bow down before him. Now, that might be what we see our church doing on Sunday. That might be like metaphorically speaking. We might see them in worship, their eyes are closed, and they are like, so to speak, or maybe actually bowing down before God and saying, God, you're so worthy, and that's all that they're thinking about. Now, the other word for worship in the New Testament is the word latruo, and the word latruo means to serve. And actually, the word latruo is a deeper form of worship. Not in the sense of like we go deeper into worship in some mystical way, but it is the more devoted form of worship. And think about this. Think about the sacrifice that it takes. And I'm not saying that we need to compare forms of worship necessarily, because both are important, but think about the sacrifice it takes to sing a song, right? To proskuneo, so to speak. I want to praise God. I want to either physically or just in my heart posture bow down before him. All right, that's one form of worship. That's a sacrifice. But think about the deeper sacrifice of actually being obedient to God and serving him. That's what I mean by the deeper form of worship. And obviously your church, the people of your church, have the opportunity to do that throughout the week. But when they gather together, really we're singing to God, which I'm not saying is a bad thing. We're supposed to do that too. My point is, though, that you, while your church might be proskuneo worshiping, you might be latruo worshiping. While your church might be bowing down in reverence of God, just fixing their minds on him, not thinking about anything else, you are latruo worshiping. You are serving God, and that is just as much worship as their bowing down. And that's not to say that you can never do the proskuneo side. I'm just saying, if we feel like we're caught up in the responsibilities, view your responsibilities as serving God. I mean, what greater calling do we have than to facilitate the corporate worship of God's people? Hebrews 13 puts it this way. Through him, then, let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God. That is, here's the first way, the fruit of lips that acknowledge his name. So, singing to God with thankfulness in our hearts, right? But, verse 16, do not neglect to do good and to share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God. Do you think when you focus on playing the right chords, that is pleasing to God, that you aren't neglecting to do good? For such sacrifices are pleasing to God. Or perhaps you need to hear from Romans 12, which I know you've heard before, but hear it again in the context of our conversation. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual latreia, which comes from the word latruo. It's the noun form of latruo. It's your rational service. It is your spiritual worship, but it is an act of service. It is giving yourself for the work of God. So if you feel like you aren't worshiping when you're leading worship, realize that you're leading worship, if done as a response to the treasuring of God in your hearts, is worship. So that's the first misunderstanding that we need to correct. Hopefully we've corrected that now, and you see that your act of leading your church is worship. The second misunderstanding, I think, is a misunderstanding of corporate worship. And here's what I mean by that. I mean that when we gather for corporate worship, we have this idea, and maybe it comes from our individualized American culture, or maybe you're outside of America, I don't know. But we get this idea that when we come to church, it's like, I need to have a me and God moment. And I need to just be able to close my eyes, to block out everyone else in the room, and then I can just go to God, one-on-one, and not have to worry about anyone else. And then we associate that with worship. And we say, because I can't do that, I'm not worshiping God. But do you want to know a secret? That's not really a secret. It's just how the Bible talks about corporate worship. When you gather together with the people of God for corporate worship, it's not just about you and God, although there is an aspect of that. But more so, it's about you and the people around you. There is a vertical relationship in our corporate worship between us and God, but there is also a horizontal relationship. And just because we have to focus on other people, specifically as worship leaders, and consider how are they responding in worship? Do I need to do anything to maybe lead them better in the right direction? Do I need to share a piece of scripture or something like that, or encourage them in some way? When you have those thoughts, that is an act of corporate worship, because when we gather for corporate worship, we are gathering to glorify God, which you could say is the one-on-one, but it's also the whole church coming together to worship him. But it is also to glorify God and to edify each other. So the act of corporate worship is not just about us and God, but it is also about us gathering together, not forsaking to gather together, as has become the habit of some, but encouraging one another, all the more as the day draws near. It is to sing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, teaching and admonishing one another. It is, 1 Corinthians, to do everything for the sake of building one another up. Do you hear all the one another's? There's a bunch of one another's in 1 Corinthians 14, maybe? I forget what chapter it is, but go check out 1 Corinthians 14 and tell me if you think that I need to come into a room and just close my eyes and focus on God for an hour and not worry about the people around me. No, that's not what the whole book of 1 Corinthians is about. It's about building each other up when we gather together. And what a great privilege you have as the leader of the gathering to do that. I mean, that's probably what you're focused on most of the time, and you're thinking, because I'm only focused on that, I'm not worshiping God. But I'm saying, once again, that is worship. And the third misunderstanding, I kind of touched on this before, but the third misunderstanding is that worship is primarily a feeling. It's that feeling, that goosebumpy feeling that you get where you're like, when I feel this way, I'm worshiping God. And I know when I say that, people are like, well, I don't do that, but I'm telling you, you do that. You think, if I have this euphoric experience, and I'm not even saying that we never have those experiences, I'm just saying that just because you don't have that experience doesn't mean that you aren't worshiping. I don't know if I said that right or not, but if you don't have those feelings, it doesn't mean that you're not worshiping God. And I think when people ask this question, what they're saying is, I'm not able to have that euphoric feeling because I'm distracted by a million other things. Therefore, I'm not worshiping God. And I'll just repeat again what I said before. You're focusing on a million other things can be worship to God if it flows from treasuring God in your hearts above all other things. So those were the misunderstandings. Let me give you one super practical way that perhaps you can feel like you are worshiping more, even though you already are worshiping whenever you lead worship. But let's just talk about something super practical that you can do, and don't roll your eyes, but this is it. Be more prepared. The more prepared you are musically, the more it will free you up spiritually to do the spiritual side of leading worship. Yes, there are a million logistical parts of leading musical worship on Sunday. I've already talked about them. You got to remember the lyrics, you got to remember the chords, you got to switch between chords, you got to think about transitions, so on and so forth. You got to think about what to say. The more we prepare that stuff in advance, and those are the things that you can prepare in advance, put in the work, learn your songs, quit reading off of a piece of paper, learn the songs, they're not that difficult, and then focus on the spiritual side of leading worship. It's really that easy. If you feel like you aren't worshiping because you've got to think about a million other things and you've been leading worship for 10 years, at this point, the logistical side of leading worship, barring some, circumstance where you're in a new place or something, but if you've been leading at the same church for the past 10 years, you shouldn't still be worried about playing your songs. I know some people just gasped, but I'm like, come on, this is 10 years of experience. And we're worried about, am I going to play the right chord? All right, what have you been doing for the past 10 years? You've been practicing. You have 10 years of experience. Quit worrying about what chords to play. You know what chords you need to play. It's the same 4 chords for every worship song. Be prepared. Learn your songs in advance, and then when you show up on Sunday, your fingers will do the work automatically. I'm not thinking, what chord do I need to go to whenever I'm playing a worship song? And I'm not special. I'm not saying I'm some superhuman, okay? It's the same 4 chords over and over again. Learn the chord pattern once and you'll be good. I know I oversimplified that a lot, but sometimes I feel that way. It's like, come on. Quit thinking about those things. All you have to do is prepare in advance and you're good to go and you're not thinking about that stuff. And then you can focus on the spiritual side of worship, which is what we should be focusing on. We should be able to get past all of that musical stuff. Not that that stuff's not important, but we can do it in advance. And then you can think about, okay, how am I going to lead this speaking transition? How am I going to, what scripture am I going to point people to in the Bible? What am I going to pray for? So many people spend so much of their time focusing on just the musical thing that we don't even focus on the spiritual thing. So put in the work, and you will feel more like you are worshiping. Now, if you want to improve your worship leading, not just the musical side, but the spiritual side as well, check out the free audio training I put together called 5 Tips to Instantly Improve Your Worship Leading. In that audio training, I give you 5 super simple things you can do before you lead this Sunday, and I think during when you lead worship this Sunday, that will instantly improve your worship leading. They aren't hard to do. You just have to make the conscious effort to do them. So check that out down in the description below. Other than that, thanks so much for joining me. Until I see you in the next video, keep leading worship well.